Okay, well, thanks everybody. And if we might dive in, we'll be joined by one or two others as the conversation unfolds. We have the real privilege of turning from a Christian nationalism conversation to one about spiritual formation and upbuilding and uplift and a particular story, or even two, in the next session. Get to introduce quickly Pete Weiner, who's probably known to most of you, and Philip Yancey. This will be a little bit different in structure, similar, but we're going to hear from Philip first, connected to the book Where the Light Fell, which I have here, his autobiography and memoir, really, which, by the way, we have for you. So by the break, it'll come to you at your place. And then we'll also hear from Pete Weiner, a little bit from the third, not really the third of his books, but he'll be really good on, obviously, context. But Pete wrote a wonderful piece in The Atlantic about Philip. They have a friendship, and that's really what led us to get Philip Yancey today before you. And so just to quickly introduce the two of them before they have a little conversation as well following. What really is going to happen is Philip's going to speak first, and then I'm going to ask a couple questions to Pete tied to his book and his story, and then Pete and Philip are going to have a conversation, and then we'll flip it over to you just like today. Philip Yancey first is the author of 25 books that have sold more than 17 million copies in the world, translated, I guess, into 51 languages. And he talks about some of them and some of the threads in Where the Light Fell. He's written books like What's So Amazing About Grace, 2002, The Jesus I Never Knew, 95, Disappointment with God in 1988. He has this sort of refreshing honesty in his writing and has won 13 Medallion Book Awards from various Christian publishers. He's been a journalist himself for 20 years, editing a magazine in Chicago. He's written for The Times, The Atlantic, Christianity Today. He and his wife, Janet, moved to the foothills in 1992, where they live now. And Janet's with us today, too, which is a gift. And his latest piece for Christianity Today is personal and it's vulnerable. Tim published it, but it's called Parkinson's, The Gift I Didn't Want. And it's a real beauty. So if you haven't seen it yet, I would encourage that. And then we'll hear second from Pete Weiner, who, of course, served in public service in government administrations of Reagan, Bill Bennett, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, where he was a speechwriter with our late friend, Mike Gerson, and then directed the Office of Strategic Initiatives at the White House for a number of years that followed. He has a regular column at The Atlantic, where he's a contributing writer. He writes often a religion piece for the New York Times, quite brilliantly. He's a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. He's written 3 books. The Death of Politics is the most recent, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. Also, The City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era with Mike. And Wealth and Justice, which he wrote with Arthur Brooks in 2010. So thank you both so much for being here. Philip Yancey, if we would, maybe you could start us off on spiritual formation and your story.
Yeah, let me tell you a bit about my story, which you can read in detail when you get these memoirs. I grew up in Atlanta, not too far away. In the height of the civil rights movement, I graduated high school in 1966. So, of course, Martin Luther King died in 68, right in the middle of all that. I went to a tiny little fundamentalist church. We saw the Southern Baptists as the liberals. This was an independent church, and I actually lived in a trailer home, 8 by 48 feet, with my mother and brother on the grounds of this church, so I could never get away from it. And just to put us on the map, if you had your left, my right, if you had Union Theological Seminary here, and Wheaton and Fuller Theological Seminary here, and maybe Liberty University here, Bob Jones University here, Genghis Khan over here, this would be my church. And there were about 100 people in the church, and we thought there may be as many as 120 in heaven, but probably no more than that. And I learned, of course, when you're a kid, you just believe everything they tell you, right? They're the adults, they know. And I did, and then went through a process of being disabused and maybe abused as well. But I learned an important lesson early on, and that is that not everyone who claims to speak for God does so. And I learned it in several dramatic ways. One of them, I didn't find out till I was 18 years old. My father died when I was a year old. He was born in a pandemic, different pandemic back then, polio, and spent several months in an iron lung. And of course, I knew that he died. I grew up without a father. When I was 18, I found out the real story by reading an article in the Atlanta Journal. This secret had been kept from me all these years. And that is that the reason he died was because a group of Christians believed that he would be healed by God. So against all medical advice, they pulled him out of the iron lung, and he showed some signs of maybe a remarkable recovery for a few days, but 15 days later he died. And that, in a sense, determined my life. It guaranteed that we lived in poverty, hence the trailer, and it probably guaranteed that my mother was mentally ill. Imagine, she made a decision that resulted in her husband's death. So that was big. The second one was around race. When Jamar mentioned the curse of Ham theory, did everybody know what he was talking about? Do you know what the curse? Oh, I'm so glad to see these no's. It comes from a passage in Genesis 9 that is distorted and abominably misused, but it's been used by Arab slave traders, by Jews in ancient days, and definitely by Southern whites to justify slavery, because it's a scene where Noah, there's some weird sexual thing going on, and Noah is angry and he curses Canaan, his grandson. But Canaan's father was Ham, his son, and Ham in Hebrew evidently means burnt black. So the curse was that Canaan should serve in the tents of the other two brothers, not Ham. But that was the curse. And so it was later interpreted to mean, well, that's the black race, that's where they came from, and so they will never be the CEOs, they'll always be the servants. And we were taught, people of color make very good waiters, but they would never, of course, be the president of a company. And everybody I knew believed that in this tiny little church. And then one day I got a fellowship as a sophomore in high school to the Communicable Disease Center, now called Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And studied, I wanted to impress my boss, Dr. Cherry. He was a renowned biologist who specialized in staining bacteria. And I couldn't understand these papers that he wrote. And I walked into his office, and Dr. Cherry was a black man. And I almost dropped my papers. It was a huge revelation. I mean, I truly believed the curse of Ham story. And that became a bit of a crisis of faith for me, because if the church lied about race, maybe they lied about Jesus, maybe they lied about the Bible. And I went through a period, we didn't know the word back then, of I guess, deconstructing my faith. And it took a long time for it to be reconstructed. But then a third incident that really cemented that not everybody speaks for God happened in my family. My brother was preternaturally gifted in music. He had absolute pitch and pretty much absolute memory. So he could hear a concerto going on in the background while we were eating dinner, and then a month later be able to play it from memory. It was astonishing to see the kind of gift before which you bow. And my brother wanted to study music, so he decided to go to Wheaton College, the Conservatory of Wheaton. I'll read you a little passage here. Then comes one of those pivotal days that begins like any other, but alters a life forever. I return home from my job on the catering truck to find Marshall, my brother, sitting at the kitchen table going through the day's mail. He looks up, waves an open envelope, and grins like he's just won the lottery. "You won't believe it," he crows. "Not only did they accept me," that's the Wheaton Conservatory, "they're offering me a scholarship." "Hey, congratulations," I say. "You got your number one choice. I hear Wheaton's a great school, and it's Christian. Surely Mother won't object." I couldn't be more wrong. That evening, the three of us eat dinner around the dining room table. Marshall says little as I describe my day's adventures on the route. I can tell he's churning inside. Just as we finish eating, Marshall brings up the letter. "So I got some good news today," he says in a nervous voice. "Wheaton accepted me and gave me financial aid." Mother reacts quickly as if she's mentally rehearsed this discussion. She knew he was looking to transfer somewhere, and he'd mentioned Wheaton in passing. "I'd rather you go to some place like Harvard," she says, in a low, gruff voice, pronouncing the name with contempt. "There, they don't even pretend to believe in God. Wheaton claims to, but they're liberal. They use the same words we do, but they don't really mean them. They're apostate, son. You're as likely to lose your faith there as at any secular university, maybe more likely." Marshall takes the bait. "Get serious. Wheaton's a Christian college. It's just not as narrow-minded as some others. Didn't Billy Graham attend there?" Wrong answer. Her voice rises. "Yeah, look at him, inviting liberals and Catholics onto his platform, meeting with the Pope, talking about someday visiting Russia. That's exactly what I mean." She makes two threats. One threat was when she found out who was going to drive him to Wheaton, so she got a warrant from a federal judge to arrest him for kidnapping for crossing state lines with her son, who was under 18. Marshall does not yield. "Then I'll fly. What's he going to do? Issue a warrant against Delta Airlines?" Silence descends as mother contemplates the next threat. Her jaw tendon twitches faster, though her facial expression does not change. When she speaks, the words come in a burst of fury. "Make fun of me if you want. I'll do whatever it takes to stop you, young man. You listen to me. If you find a way to pull off this plan, I guarantee you one thing. I'll pray every day for the rest of your life that God will break you. Maybe you'll be in a terrible accident and die. That'll teach you. Or better yet, maybe you'll be paralyzed. Then you'll have to lie on your back and stare at the ceiling and realize what a rebellious thing you've done, going against God's will and everything you've been brought up to believe for going to Wheaton College." Her words hang in the air like a cloud of poison gas. Once released, it cannot be put back in the canister. Marshall pushes away from the table, scraping his chair so hard it leaves marks on the floor. He heads toward his bedroom, and a few seconds later, I hear the slam of a door. I keep my head down, pretending to read a magazine. My vision blurs, and a quickened pulse throbs in my temples. "Be still, my heart," is the only thought I can form. In the tense quiet that follows, I picture my father lying motionless in an iron lung, staring at fluorescent lights overhead. "I'll pray every day that God will break you." She would pray for that? Dozens, scores of times in ensuing years, my brother and I have replayed that scene together. We recall the same vivid details, the prominent W on the acceptance letter lying atop a pile of junk mail, the cold, hard words coming from a face twisted in rage. Yet we always disagree about one crucial point, what our mother actually said after the words "better yet." I remember the threat of paralysis, while Marshall remembers a different version. Or better yet, maybe you'll lose your mind. Those words embedded in him ever after, like barbed wire pressing into a tree's heartwood. To this day, I believe my brother's subconscious has backfilled his memory of her threat with what actually happened at Wheaton. So that was the third, maybe most dramatic. And my life ever since has been a way of trying to reclaim anything of value in that faith, because I was saturated, immersed, baptized in it, deconstructed, and had to go through a process of reconstructing. My brother took a very different path than I did. He dropped out of Wheaton his last semester, started taking LSD, became one of Atlanta's original hippies, and fried his brain, basically, on LSD. I became a journalist. And I know most of the people you have here are experts in some way. They're either a pastor or a theologian or a sociologist or some sort of expert. And as we know, journalists are not experts, we're generalists. But our job is to take complicated things and try to break them down and metabolize them for our readers. So if your boss assigned you to go figure out fusion energy in the latest experiment in California, you don't know anything about fusion, but that's your job. So you go out there and interview people and check it on the internet, and we'll eventually write an article about it. And for me, that was faith, trying to figure out my faith. And so many of my books have questions in the title. Where is God When It Hurts was my first book. Prayer Doesn't Make Any Difference. Church, Why Bother? What's So Amazing About Grace? And as I look back, I feel blessed, truly, that's the right word, blessed, to be able to full-time explore spiritual formation, explore my faith, to sort through what I should discard. So much of what I was brought up I have had to discard. And yet I saw the alternative, especially vividly in my brother, who threw everything away in the way he made very self-destructive choices. I didn't want to go that route, and I felt there must be something worth keeping there. And I've been able to as a writer, to spend my life picking up pieces of my faith one by one and trying to figure them out and break them down to metabolize them first for myself and then for anybody else who has had the same questions. And I'm always astonished that a lot of people do have the same questions that I grapple with. And so I'm not a propagandist, I'm not an expert, I'm an explorer. I had about a 10-year cocoon period, kind of recovery period. I envisioned God looking at me and saying, well, Philip, you've seen the worst that the church has to offer. Let me show you the best. And he introduced me to a man, Dr. Paul Brand, an astonishing man, kind of a Mother Teresa with a modern laboratory, because he lived in India, was a surgeon, and worked among the lowest people on the entire planet. And those would be people who are in the Dalit, formerly untouchable caste, in India, who have leprosy. And I could tell you stories that would chill you. And here was a man who was offered head of surgery at Oxford University and at Stanford University, and turned both of those down to serve among those people in this miserable leprosarium until he transformed the landscape as well. And he became a father figure to me, and I wrote his story for about 10 years, and I could write with great integrity about his life and his faith, whereas mine was just taking shape, was forming. I couldn't write about that at all. And so that was a preparation for what I would do later. You said 20 years as a journalist, more like 44, I must say, Josh. And at first, I thought, wouldn't it be great to be like Woodard and Bernstein, in the Christian world, where you find these frauds and you expose them. And I did a couple articles along that line and didn't enjoy it very much because you're around jerks all the time. And they have lawyers and they're always trying to sue you, So then I decided, no, why don't you find people that you can learn from and want to be like? And I have spent a lot of my journalistic life finding people like Bono and Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative and Gary Haugen and Francis Collins and people like that. We started traveling internationally. My books, I guess I was most surprised that my own background somehow related to people in other cultures, because I thought, well, they won't even know what I'm talking about, but actually they do. It turns out missionaries are not quite as conservative as the people I grew up in, but they're on the conservative end of things. So when I write about legalism, they can identify in their own cultural way. And wherever I went, it really encouraged my faith, because I found wherever the missionaries had been, there was a trail of hospitals and clinics and orphanages and development organizations and anti-sexual trafficking organizations. And I found the fruit of our faith. In fact, you can go on Transparency International, for example, and look on the countries that are listed by corruption, and 9 out of 10 of them would be Christian heritage countries, and that would be true of earth care, of charity, of freedom of the press, of freedom of democracy. Almost every measure of things that we value, when they rank countries, 9 out of 10 of them are Christian heritage. And I remember being interviewed by Nick Kristof, who said, well, yeah, Christian heritage countries, half of them are Scandinavian, and they don't even believe in God anymore. They're just trying to get away from faith. But that didn't surprise me because Jesus said the kingdom of God works like this. He said he used only small things. It works like a sprinkling of yeast in a loaf of bread. It works like a little bit of salt that keeps the whole piece of meat from going bad. It works like the smallest, not largest, smallest seed in the garden that falls into the ground and dies, and out of it comes a great bush, and the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And in places like Sweden, where few people go to church at all, but what was Sweden before? During a lot of history, I was reading a book the first time I went to Stockholm, Sweden, a book on the history of Christianity in Europe, and it said for 250 years, most prayers in Europe ended with this line, "Lord, save us from the Vikings, amen." So now Sweden is off the charts on charity and earth care and human rights and all those things that we cherish, even though they don't believe in God. And that's what Jesus said. You know, the gospel, it starts small, it transforms individuals, and it grows into a great bush. And the bush is still there and still attracting the birds of the air to nest in its branches. When I look back now on my life, which I spent several years exploring in writing this memoir, I see it as a great gift. The gift that I was given was a very toxic church and a psychotic family. That was my gift, but it feels like a gift because it gave me that point of view that you can't trust what people say. You have to really dig it out for yourself. And it also gave me the lingering sense that there was something worth grabbing onto, somehow cleaning off the toxic version that I was brought up with. There was something, a pearl of great price, worth digging through the muck and polishing to try to find out what that was. And so often, like I'll be sitting on an airplane, you know, when you've got work to do, people say, "Oh, tell me about you. Do you live here?" "Yeah, I do." "Oh, really? What do you do?" And I'll usually say something like, "Well, I'm a Christian author who writes about existential questions that people have." And then they'll leave me alone for the whole flight. But sometimes they don't. And then sometimes they say, "Oh, yeah, I used to be into that faith stuff. I went to a Young Life Club. I went to a summer camp, and I just don't buy it anymore." And they'll tell, why not? And they'll tell me their story. And I'll laugh and say, "Oh, it's a lot worse than that. Let me tell you my story." and I think that was my preparation. My preparation was to go in that, what I thought was a single explorer trying to find something of value. But I have been blessed to see the transformation in individuals, in communities, and then ultimately whole societies that can happen as a result of spiritual formation, I guess you would say. I've got to tell you, after sitting through the session this morning and sitting through the situation of the church in the country today, I don't recognize evangelicals. I don't recognize who they are. This is so different. When I was growing up, our whole goal was to be different, be separate, come out from among them and be separate. Don't be worldly, don't be like the world. We weren't into politics at all. I think probably most of the people in my church didn't vote. We were too concerned about, should we go bowling because they serve alcohol in bowling alleys? Should we read the Sunday paper? You know, questions like that. We didn't care about justice and politics and stuff. And one of the verses in one of Paul's letters says that perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. And I was aware of how fear-ridden evangelicalism that I have known has been. We were afraid of Y2K, remember that? And AIDS and LGBTQ and fluoride in the drinking water and secular humanists and masks and vaccines. You know, it's a fear-driven movement, which is the exact opposite of what we're told to be. Perfect love casts out fear, but I've also learned that perfect fear casts out love. Perfect fear casts out love. And I think that's where we are now. We're in a fear-driven movement that people no longer associate with love. And Jesus said, if there's one thing I leave with you, you're to be known by how you love. And we're not doing that very well. So I have a lot more thoughts, but that's plenty to get us started. And I'd like to interact on some of what we heard this morning too, but thank you. And you can read the rest of the story, all my dirty secrets in this book that you'll get free of charge, courtesy of my publisher.
Thank you, Philip. That's really all right, so we're thinking of asking just a couple questions to Pete, maybe that draw out some of these same themes. You have this friend, Russell Moore, who's spoken to this group before, who sometimes talks about this idea of a hood ornament for faith, as opposed to something that's really driving you. And, it seems possible, right, to lose your soul in D.C., especially if you work in the highest places in government, which you've done. Would be curious, Pete, to ask, Philip says there's a kernel worth pursuing, there's a yeast or a small seed. How have you kept focused on that kernel? How have you, practices-wise, maintained healthier habits in terms of spiritual formation, from friendship to congregational life and so forth?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, Josh, and for being the leader of the Faith Angle Forum, and Philip for that very moving talk about your life and your journey, and a journey that's touched my life a lot as well. We may get into that. In terms of the practices for me, and the tensions of being a person in positions of power in politics, in my case also a person of the Christian faith. That's central to who I am. What are the practices or things that have been important to me? The first thing I would say is it's always good to probably ask the people who are critical of you to see how grounded you really are. And so I'm probably not as grounded as I'm sure I'm not as grounded as I wish I was, and I'm not as grounded as I think I am. But to the degree that I am grounded, I do think that my faith has helped me in that journey. And I think I'm in a better place because of my faith. I would say, in my own experience, the first thing that I would identify would be people in my life, role models. That has been part of my story from a very early age through my faith pilgrimage. And it was really a matter of identifying certain people that I thought had integrity and that embodied the kind of life that I wanted to lead, or had certain qualities that I wanted to emulate. And throughout my life, just ask the question, and this is actions, it's when I write, which is, what would this person or these individuals think if they knew what I was doing, or what I was saying, or what I was going to write? What would their judgment be? And that's just a simple thing to do, but it's been important. One person in my life, Steve Hayner. Steve was, when I was at University of Washington, when I was early in my faith pilgrimage, he was a youth pastor at University Presbyterian Church. And he later became president of InterVarsity in Columbia Theological Seminary. But when I knew him, he was running something called the Inn, which was a Tuesday evening service, which University of Washington students would come to. And Steve started it in the early 70s. I think 30 people went to it. By the time I got to University of Washington in the late 70s, early 80s, 900 students would show up and on a Tuesday night. And I didn't know Steve well, but I had a sense that there was a person of integrity, someone whom I admired. And I was dealing with something that I never shared with anyone, something that was a kind of source of shame and a secret. And I had enough confidence and trust in Steve that I thought, I've got to go and talk to him and share that. And I still remember it was a Tuesday afternoon. I was halfway toward his office, and I thought, I'm going to turn around and cancel this appointment, but I didn't do it. I went ahead and I talked. And it was a kind of a life-changing moment for me. The issue that I was dealing with wasn't as large as I thought it was. It's often the case with secrets in your life. which is if you keep them as secrets, they become larger than in reality they might be. But that began a friendship, and Steve, up until he passed away in 2015, was a huge figure in my life. And at every key moment in my life, I would come to him with key decisions, and he was always a factor. I always wanted to keep him as one of the people that I thought about as a role model. So that's one thing I've tried to do. The second thing is community, just to be a part of a community of folks. There are people here who know much better than I of the power of community in shaping us as human beings. And I've tried to choose friendships and relationships that have been encouraging to me and have helped, I think, lift my sides rather than pull them down. And so that's a really big deal to me. In Confessions, in the book 8 of Confessions, Augustine talks about his own journey toward faith, and he lists a number of the friends that he was about, and they embodied certain things in their lives that pulled him toward the faith and shaped him. Third is the shaping of sensibilities. I really think that when you enter the whole arena of faith, the sensibilities in which you enter it have a huge outcome on how you interpret faith. The books of faith, the scriptures, and so forth. And we have to find ways, and I've tried to find ways, again, imperfectly so, to shape them. And that's through books, and that's through music, and that's through other kinds of things, sort of elevate the sensibilities. Fourth, I've tried to be intentional about staying in touch with people with whom I disagree, because I have strong opinions in politics, and you can tell that if you read what I write. And so there's a real temptation for me to dehumanize the people that I disagree with, and to take on an air of real superiority, and sometimes just feel like I want to bring down the hammer, bring down the rhetorical hammer. Again, I haven't done this nearly as well as I should, but there are people with whom I disagree, and when I'm in touch with those people, it just changes the way that I view them. Just one story about that. There's a person in the conservative media complex who I've become friends with. He has very different views on politics than I do. He's a very strong Trump supporter, kind of MAGA world, and I'm not, to say the least. But over the course of that relationship, we moved from a political debate to try and learn about each other's lives. And so I learned about his wife and when she died of cancer, and the difficulty that happened with his children, and the hardships that he went through. Just in talking to him, I learned about why Christmas was such a hard holiday, because his father died around Christmas. And that just I began to connect with him just on a human level, not on a political level. And what was interesting was that then allowed sort of open the aperture of our political discussions. So he's much more likely now to listen to me if we have a difference on politics, because there's a kind of trust that's taken place. And the same for me, too. I'm much more likely now to hear his point of view and to try and understand him, so that that impulse, that temptation to dehumanize is really strong, and we have to find ways to humanize the people that we disagree with without giving up the principles that we care about. And then I think the last thing is just to have people in your life who have standing in your life that can, in my case, call me out and ask, what is it that I'm blind to? What are the things that I'm missing? So those are the things that have been important to me.
Thank you, Pete. And you mentioned in your most recent Atlantic piece about forbearance versus retribution, a little bit about emotion maybe being a bigger driver than you first perceived in the Trump sort of era. I think you quote Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist, by saying that perhaps in most corners of the country, the Trump vote was more tied to feelings of being dishonored and humiliated.
Yeah.
Trump supporters feel that they've been disrespected. Trump's their response, their antidepressant. Has your view of emotion in contemporary politics changed at all in the last decade? And how significant is that in your attempt to stay spiritually grounded when emotion is so on the line?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'd say probably the biggest change I've had, and one of the biggest changes at least in the last 10, 15 years, is the degree to which psychology and human emotions influences not just politics, but also faith. When I was younger, I had much more confidence, I think, in the capacity of arguments to persuade people, and that life was lived at a cognitive level. And I don't think that's nearly the case. A lot of life is lived at a cognitive level, and you can't give up on persuasion and reason. But I would say that that Hume's right. The reason's often the slave to the passions, and that these emotions are the things that sort of drive us. And then we construct our arguments or our political views or our theological views to fit whatever those emotions are. So yeah, I think back to what I said earlier, the shaping of the sensibilities is a big deal. And I think the emotions that we have, the psychology helps shape that. In terms of, when I think about the evangelical movement, which is the movement that I've been most a part of throughout my life, certainly more than I anticipated when I began my faith journey, I would say that people's core identity is, and here I'm talking about people who proclaim to be Christians, is less faith than it is a lot of other things. And that can be cultural, it can be sociological, it can be political. But if you gave them sodium pentothal and said, what's the top of your pyramid? Most of the people I know would say faith. They would say, this is what I care about most, this is what I'm most committed to, and this is the outworking of the faith. I think in reality, what the situation is that faith is subordinate to a lot of those other things. And then what you do is you go back and you proof text and say, well, how can I get in the case for Christians, the Bible to affirm what I already believe. So I think it's a really big deal. And one thing that Philip said, which is very true in my experience too, with the Trump world, is fear. I think it's hard to overstate how important factor fear is in the lives of a lot of Christians. That's what Arlie Hochschild was getting at when she said there was feeling being dishonored, disrespected. And the number of people that I've talked to over, particularly since 2016, who speak as if this is an apocalyptic moment, as if almost everything they know and love is under attack and under siege. And if this election goes wrong or we lose this particular court case, that everything is going to fall apart. I think that's extremely powerful. And when fear is driving people, that catalyzes a whole set of negative emotions. And as Philip said, that's not a Christian virtue. I mean, one of the most frequent commands in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament is fear not and be not afraid. And yet I think fear is driving a lot of it. And there's now a kind of threat addiction and fear addiction on the right. There's a whole movement, which I think we see in a kind of conservative right-wing Christian infrastructure, which takes advantage of that. Mark Lapperton is a good friend of ours. He used to be president of Florida Theological Seminary. When I was talking to Mark, he said that we need a redisciplining of our emotions, and we have to affix them on the right things. That, of course, raises the question of how you do that. But I do think that emotions is a huge part of, and passions is a huge part of what explains this moment.
You guys should talk a little bit.
Yeah, Philip, I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on this topic of suffering. One is to relay a conversation that Philip and I had, and then there's a couple of things that Philip has experienced in his own life on suffering. In terms of the conversation, we were we were having a discussion with a group of other people a few months ago, and the topic of suffering came up. We were actually talking about Thomas Merton essays. And so I was asking these different people about suffering and what to make of suffering. And one person, a very thoughtful individual, said, I think suffering can destroy a lot of idols in our life. And this person has experienced suffering, and I think there's a lot to what he said, but partly because of things that I've gone through and experienced and seen and heard from others. I said, sometimes suffering is just suffering. Sometimes there are no idols to destroy. There's no great lesson to learn. Sometimes it's just painful. And how do you think about that? And Philip said something to me, which has stayed with me, which is he said, Pete, I don't know why God allows suffering, but God is on the side of the sufferer. And in your essay that you wrote, which you had mentioned to me before it was published about Parkinson's, you said that pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed, which I thought was a lovely, lovely sentiment. You've talked a lot about suffering. In 2007, the massacre at Virginia Tech, they asked you to come down to speak to the families who were in enormous grief. Then in 2012, Sandy Hook, you went to Newtown after that massacre. I think you were in Japan that year. There had been an earthquake and tsunami that had killed 20,000 people, something like that. So you've experienced suffering. You've helped people through suffering. Can you dilate some on that topic and also in the context of spiritual formation and faith?
Yeah, I remember that call in 2007. I had an accident where I rolled off a cliff. In fact, my Ford Explorer turned over 5 times and I ended up with a broken neck. And a little clinic, they had a CT scan, but they didn't have a radiologist, so everything had to be modemed to Australia to have the x-ray read and then modem back. And so I'm lying there strapped to a bodyboard waiting, and she wasn't with me, so she and a neighbor were driving down in a blizzard, the same blizzard that caused my rollover accident. And the doctor came in and said, well, we just got back the news from Australia, and indeed your neck is broken. It's what we call a comminuted fracture, which means it's in a lot of little pieces, and one of them is right next to the carotid artery. So our concern is that your carotid artery has been pierced. We have a jet standing by to fly you to Denver for emergency surgery, but just between you and me, if indeed it has been pierced, you won't make it to Denver. So here's a cell phone. You should call the people you love and tell them goodbye, just in case. Whoa! And it was just a few weeks later that I got a call from Virginia Tech, a Christian group on campus, saying, you wrote a book 20-some years ago called Where is God When It Hurts? That's the only question anybody's asking on this campus right now. Could you come and talk? And I said, well, I'll try, but I am still in a neck brace, and the doctor told me I couldn't fly. Well, some wealthy person found out about that and said, well, you can use my private jet. They fly at 40,000 feet. There's no turbulence. So we got escorted. And I remember standing in front of those young people who have very little experience with death or severe pain, a couple of different sessions of several thousand each. And just their faces like little birds with their beaks open, somehow give us something to get us through this moment, give us comfort. And frankly, I felt a lot more equipped standing before them in a neck brace. and then I was involved with Columbine and Aurora Theater shooting, and then Newtown, Connecticut. That was by far the toughest. It was right at Christmas time, and just an unimaginable tragedy of 20 little children whose parents had kissed them goodbye, put them on a school bus, and then later that same day gone to the morgue and recovered their blood-covered bodies. And I thought, what can I possibly say? I happened to be writing an article for Books and Culture magazine at the time on the new atheists, people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, people like that. And I came across a quote. In fact, I have it right here. I came across a quote from Richard Dawkins, who says, "The universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." And I started thinking, when a tragedy like that happens, the New York Times doesn't call Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. They call priests and pastors and rabbis. And after 9/11, you remember they ran an obituary of every person who died, a little feature article, 3,000 of them. And they weren't responding with blind, pitiless indifference. They weren't acting like there was no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. And so at first I thought going to these places of tragedy was going to really challenge and shatter my faith. And actually the opposite is true, because it allowed us to act with the best of human values, compassion and care and love and help. And I can say, as a Christian, I can say I'm confident that God is on the side of the sufferer. And the main reason I'm confident is because I'm a follower of Jesus. And every time Jesus was asked, every time, no exceptions, he responded by healing the person, or resurrecting in a few cases, the person. And so Jesus, unlike the Pharisees, unlike his own disciples, refused to play the why game. Why this person? Why not another person? Or why does God allow these kind of things? He just didn't answer those questions. He said that's kind of beyond your pay grade, as God told Job in the book of Job. But as I started thinking about all the people as a journalist that I've gotten to know over the years, life is unfair. And I've looked at, by far, every hint in the Bible that I can find, trying to understand the unfairness of life, especially when it comes to suffering. And there's no good explanation. Some people get an easy draw, some people get a tough draw, and some people get unimaginable horrors based on where they were born, or what their genes were, or something, or who they came in contact with who had a germ. And you can't figure that out, and we don't really have answers to that. But I concluded, as I went through the people that I've gotten to know through interviewing and in my own friends, some of us have a blessed life, and we have intelligence and gifts and talent and pleasure and success. And some of us have the opposite. And I think of these leprosy patients in India, and I've heard their stories and interviewed them. And they have exactly the opposite. And yet, when I look back on these people, I would just have to say that this group over here, the unfortunate ones, tend to be better stewards of what they were given than these people here, which is also biblical. When you look at the Hebrew scriptures, when things are going well, that's when people forget God. It's only when things are falling off the cliff that they'll cry out to God. And then it's all the way through the kings and one queen of Israel in the Hebrew Bible. And I just, I would never, Pete, say, let me put it this way. C.S. Lewis, in a famous quote, says that God whispers to us in the good times and shouts to us in our pain. And I wince a bit about that, because it sounds like Lewis is saying, and I don't think he means this, but it sounds like a football coach on the sideline saying, okay, give me 100 more push-ups. Give me 2 laps around, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I'll show you. I'll show you. And I know C.S. Lewis didn't say that. I would use a different analogy, that when something happens, an automobile accident, a shooting, a birth of a baby with defects or whatever, it's like we have a hearing aid, and we can either turn it down. Well, if God's going to do that to me, I'll never talk to him again, or turn it up. what can I learn? How can this be redeemed? How can this be redeemed? And I find that the people who impress me most are those not who have a pleasureful, pain-free life, if there is such a thing, but rather those who turn up the hearing aid and respond with the Christian virtues that Jesus embodied. I mean, Jesus could have chosen a pain-free life, presumably, but he chose not to. And so we who are Christians, followers of Jesus, believe that he was sent by God to show us what God is like and what we should be like. And I learn from Jesus that pain is not a personal message from you, despite what the insurance companies say by calling disasters acts of God, but rather an opportunity for us to exercise the stewardship of the unfairness of life, each of which was given a different set.
One other question, and we'll go to Q&A from the others. I'd be interested, and I think the folks here might too, a lot of your conversations, a lot of your writing, I think, is geared toward and read by ex-evangelicals, people who used to be of the evangelical faith and who have left it. They've either left the evangelical movement or in some cases they've left the faith itself. What are you hearing from them when you hear? What is, if you were to describe why it is that they have left? I mean, obviously, each story is individual, but what do you hear most often, and what do you tell them?
I was on a podcast not too long ago from Australia, pretty popular podcast in there, they tell me, called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. And there were these two guys, and they were such nice guys. And I didn't know where they were coming from, but they assured me, we're going to be kind to you. We're not going to make it too hard. Okay, thank you. So on the podcast, they said, well, this is Philip Yancey, and described me. And they said, he's been very helpful to us. He helped us go from fundamentalism to evangelicalism. Now, we're atheists now, but we appreciate that middle stage because it kind of eased us into freedom. What surprises me, Pete, because I grew up with resistance against the toxic religion, and it took me a long time to recover from some of its bad effects. What surprises me, the ex-evangelicals that I know generally don't have that kind of anger. They often have a wistful young life, or maybe they went to Steve Hayner's group, you know. They have a memory like that in the background, because evangelicalism it's a machine, and it produces a lot of stuff, and some of it's good, and some of it's not so good. And they were touched by some of the good stuff. And then something happened. The way somebody maybe in their family was treated by the church, or having a divorce, or having an abortion, or the way a gay person was treated, or science is a big one, you know, they're told this set of facts about the science, and then they go to the university and find out that wasn't true. And so what I sense from them is they wish there was some way to take the good parts of it and somehow combine it with where they are now. I guess that's what I sense. And that's why I say I feel like it was a gift to me to have the worst that the church has to offer, and then some of the best, because that's what I can offer them. You know, don't give up on the opportunity to connect with the God of the universe, a God of beauty and justice and all these things that are important to us, because of the way some crank treated you in church 30 years ago. You know, that's why I say, oh, it's a lot worse than that, but don't give up.
Okay, over to you, David Brooks. Questions can come to Philip Yancey, they can come to Peter Weiner, so either way.
For both.
Good.
It strikes me there are two subjects kind of being elided here, and they are spiritual formation and moral formation. And they can't be the same thing, because we all know people who are not spiritually formed, but who are very morally formed, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But I guess my first question is, what's the relationship between these two things in your life? And I think like spiritual formation must be an open presence with God, an open awareness, turning up the hearing aid. And moral formation must have to do with behavior. And yet there's clearly for a Christian a relationship between these two things. So I guess my question for each is, concretely, how do you think of the process of spiritual formation, and concretely in your day-to-day life, and concretely, how do you think of the process of moral formation?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm still thinking.
Okay. It's a great question, David. I think that there's a connection, but I do think that they're distinct. Because I think moral formation can go on for people who are not spiritual, who are not followers of God. And I mean, obviously, all of us know people in our lives where they're deeply moral and impressive human beings, and they're not involved in faith at all. And then there are people who claim to be deeply faithful, Christians, and their lives are at odds with that. I had a conversation. It was actually last week with somebody, and he was going through. He said 2022 was just a hard year for him. He said 2023 was starting out that way. So I asked him a little bit why, what was happening in his life. He went on to talk about it. And when we were talking about faith, he said, well, he was talking about faith in terms of for him to live as a moral person. And he said, I don't think that faith would make me that much more moral than I am. And he was asking me about the questions of faith, really along the lines of what you said. And I said, I actually don't think that faith would make you a more moral person than you are. What I know about him is he's a really impressive person, and he's having struggles with a child that require tremendous sacrifices. And I said, in my life, I don't know. I hope that faith has moved the needle somewhat in the direction of moral formation, but I'm also formed by my parents and my community, and I'm born with a certain disposition and temperament. I said, the thing the spiritual side offers most to me is a sense that we're part of a drama, and that we're actors in the drama, and that there's an author and a purpose to that, some of what Philip was referring to that, and that it's just not meaningless, and life isn't just capricious. And that gives me a kind of confidence as life goes on. And it'd be hard, I think, for me if that were removed from my life. I think there I would be a different kind of person. I also think that the spiritual formation, if it's real and if it's deep, it has the capacity to transform people's lives. I mean, I've seen that, and I do think that there are enough people in my experience who are very, very important in my life, people I know well, people that I don't know so well, that I do think that they have gone a layer deeper than they would have without their faith. And I think that has formed them morally and led them to acts of moral excellence that I think in their individual case wouldn't be the same if there hadn't been the spiritual component. But David, you and I have talked about this before. I mean, this is honestly a question that I struggle with, which is, I thought when I began my Christian journey that I believed that there would be many more transformed lives than I have experienced. And I want to put an important caveat. I've seen a lot of lives that have been transformed, and people who have shaped my life and changed my life. But it hasn't happened as much as I thought that it would be, and so I'm more hesitant than I used to be in thinking that moral lives are tied to the spiritual.
Yeah. One of the first things that came to my mind was the recovery movement. And people in the 12-step programs start by saying, I can't make it on my own. I need help from a higher power. And there are a lot of moral people who somehow lack that humility and that compassion. Jesus was so tough on the Pharisees, even though he was probably closest to them in behavior and beliefs than any group going on, because he saw what happens when they rely on, when any of us rely on our own, look, I'm better than those other people over there, and that's deadly. We start with that kind of helpless dependence. So moral teaches you how you should be, but theoretically, the spiritual formation lets you tap into a power that allows you to be more of that kind of person without being one of the Pharisee types. And one of the things that is attractive about evangelicalism, I think, is that it holds out the promise of a personal relationship with God. God loves you and has a wonderful plan for you. There are a lot of people throughout history who have lived with a different understanding of what it is to be a Christian. They go to church, like maybe in the orthodox tradition, they may not even understand the language in Russia, and it was Old Slavonic for years, and in some other countries, they just go, and it's kind of a ritual, and they want to be like that. They want to be better people because of their experience, but they don't have that. They haven't been told you can have an actual personal relationship with God, with the God of the universe. So evangelicalism kind of emphasizes that almost to a fault, you can say. I remember talking to Frederick Buechner, a friend who is a great author and died was it last year, a couple years ago. And he was from Princeton and became ordained. And then he taught at places like Yale and Harvard, and then someone asked him to teach for a semester at Wheaton College. He had never heard of them. He kept calling it Wheatland College. But he went there, and he came back and said, these people talk about, God told me to do this. God told me to go to Africa, not to Asia. God never told, I'm a minister. God's never told me those kind of things. But that's what evangelicalism promises. And I think when I say to a fault, it's like we want God to act like us. We want God to come to our level and interfere with the circumstances around us. We want God to manipulate our lives. So God, would you please do this? Would you please do that? And that's different than what God wants done in the world. How can I be a part of it? And my increasing understanding is that God is spirit. God has no need or desire to incarnate any more than he already has, and we Christians believe in Jesus. And the way to get to know God is through spiritual disciplines. And that's different than moral formation. It's silence, it's meditation, it's humility, it's things like having grace-healed eyes so that we start seeing people differently, as Pete was talking about, even people who may be hostile to you. That's not so much a moral formation, that's a spiritual formation. And I'd have to give a lot of thought to make further comparisons, but it just strikes me that kind of the great attraction of evangelicalism is also it's can be a trap too, because if God doesn't act the way we want God to act, then we blame God. And maybe it was our understanding of how God chooses to work in the world. I don't think God chooses by, constantly weighing, where am I going to interfere today of the 7 billion people in the world, 8 billion? It's rather from the ground up, bubbling up through us, almost like lava coming up from below rather than raining down from above. So the way we should be, and hopefully the power to be that kind of person, to me, those are the distinctions.
Just one other thing that struck me, David, and we'll go to the next one, which is, I do think of the people who have lived faith in a way that is exemplary to me, there is a sense that people have souls, and there's a sense of human dignity, which is, I think, quite real to them. And I think when people see that, it creates this greater capacity than to have empathy and to care for people, and even to sacrifice for people. So I think they themselves would testify that those parts of their lives are deeper, and they're self-giving and love for others is deeper than it would be if that didn't exist.
At risk of breaking a rule, to say one really quick thing that I learned as an undergraduate that stayed with me 25 years or whatever was this idea of a culture box. And the thought was that, like Pete's just saying, it was a spiritual worldview was the base, the thickest thing. Up above that one notch was cultural values. Presumably morality and moral formation would be there. And then above that was institutions, which you start to almost get to see, but not really. And then only above that would you see the surface level. And the idea was, the spiritual underneath values drive up, and eventually you see it on the surface. And yet the thing to remember is that also the habits on the top will drive down also on the other side. So the idea that you can't just go on practicing whatever you want to do for 30 years and have it take no effect down below. It does. But the idea of it both going up and down was at least interesting to me. And his idea, my history professor, was spiritual is actually deeper, which was interesting, I thought. Okay, Ann Snyder, Will Salatan, Dahlia Mogahead.
Thank you, Paul. I think the personal way in which you shared there was just very moving, so thank you. I, perhaps like a lot of people, and this is a bit of a meta question pursuant to the dominant craft in this room, I personally have gotten, frankly, bored with the polarization thesis that is all that explains the dysfunction in this country, and something about it just feels far too easy and not reflective of the complexity of most human beings you meet, if not all human beings. It explains a lot, but it overly dominates the headlines. Yeah. And you only really see descriptions and evocative portrayals of sensibilities to, I think it was your number 4, Pete, maybe number 3, the shaping of sensibilities in obituaries. Mm-hmm. The book market, interestingly, feels swamped with psychological, and are selling books about strengths and personalities, and of course the Enneagram is taken off and all that sort of thing. But somehow our journalism doesn't tend to cover, except what you can sort of gather from a quote, issues of moral sensibility. And I'm wondering if you could at least pontificate a little bit on why that may be, and any advice you would give, or whether you think it might be a positive thing for journalists of various beats to learn how to capture more of this sort of moral sensibility in their stories and in their reporting, because I do think that's often a more accurate way to capture, and a more interesting way to capture some of our divides these days, at least in the U.S.
Yeah. You want to take that one first, Philip?
I think story is the way. David's books show that. You talk about character by showing character. And in my case, for example, I was very wounded and a very unlikely candidate to return to faith. But it took just one person, Dr. Paul Brand, with a close-up look to convince me, oh, so this is what God had in mind with the human race. And if we devoted more of our attention to that, to truly finding authentic people, Ibana would be another example. I haven't read his book, Surrender, but I've heard him talk about it. And I think that's probably the most effective way of presenting a message in a non-divisive way, because you can't really refute a person's story unless you find them lying, George Santos. But when I look at the quote evangelical, is it the ECPA bestsellers list? It's embarrassing. It's really embarrassing. It's all shallow self-help stuff, and how long has that stuff been going on? 30 ways to save your marriage. Well, it was 15 last year, and it was 10 the year before, and the divorce rate increases or doesn't change. This is not how character changes with these little easy formula books. But they do sell.
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree with your premise, and I do think that the polarization frame is too simplistic. I mean, obviously we're a polarized country, but there's a lot more that's going on and understanding what's behind that. I think part of the answer, one is that human lives are just more complicated, more interesting when we talk about the nuances of life. And it does just make a better story. I think for journalists who know in the faith community that those stories exist, they themselves can write about them. I mean, I've done a series of profiles in the Atlantic because there are people who were important in my life or that I've learned from. And it's just an effort to sort of say, this is this person's story, and this is how they arrived at this story, and this is their faith journey. The reaction you get is, wow, people have a lot of parts to them. When in the case of the evangelical world, which, I mean, I've written a lot about it, there's a lot to complain about it. Jamar said earlier that, the main threat to American democracy and the witness of the church is how the evangelical movement is the white nationalist, Christian white nationalist movement. And I think that's right, and that's very painful. But of course, that's not the sum total of it either. So some of it is just to have people who are curious about it or who know that world, and to be able to tell those stories. And then some of it is just being in conversation with people. I have a friend who's an atheist, Jewish and gay, and he had a certain view of what the Christian community was like. And over time, he's gotten to meet other people in that world. And he hasn't changed he's still an atheist, but he has, I think, a much more subtle understanding, and he hasn't put people in these sort of cartoon caricatures. And a couple of weeks ago, he and a theologian and a pastor friend and I went to the Museum of the Bible. Now that's just part of what kind of conversations and life and friendships do. And I think journalists need to be able to get out and see people in their complexities, not just to conform to some impressions that they have, which can be real but may be incomplete.
Will Salatin.
Thanks to both of you. I wanted to ask about Philip. You had three phrases that really stuck in my head from your talk. One was about turning up the hearing aid. Another was about when something terrible happens, the New York Times doesn't call Richard Dawkins. And the third one was about the phrase, lovely phrase, stewardship of the unfairness of life. Let me start with the last one. So stewardship of the unfairness of life, there's sort of two parts to it. There's the unfairness of life, which is sort of the objective world, and there's the stewardship, which is subjective. I don't want to be simplistic, but that's roughly a distinction. And I find myself, I'll just speak for myself and people like me, I'm basically with Richard Dawkins about the unfairness of life, right? I don't think that God is intervening to save some lives and not save others. But when you talk about the hearing aid, turning up the hearing aid, that resonates very much with me and with my experience, with my personal experience and experience with people I know. So I have this weird disjunction between being an atheist about the objective world and experiencing God or the idea of God personally and among people I know, and seeing that manifest in the world in the way people behave when they have their hearing aid turned up, right? And I'm not really sure how to form this question. I guess part of my question is, the way I think about it, I'm sort of not spiritual about the world, but I'm spiritual about people. I feel like spirituality is a good way of understanding human beings. And it makes me very interested in spiritual formation because that's real. I just see it. It just happens out there. And it makes a huge difference in the world. So is what I believe, and people like me, again, if you find a better way to form this question, please do. Is that faith? Is that sociology? Is that something in between? What is that?
I would call that advanced echoes, maybe. The name of this book my story is Where the Light Fell, which is actually a quote from St. Augustine, who said, I couldn't look at the sun directly, but I could look on the places where the light fell. And he had his own reasons. My reasons, I couldn't look at the sun directly because I had been scorched by that sun. That sun was this frowning super cop in the sky, just waiting to smash people, like my brother. You're going to be at an iron lung like your father. You know, that was my view of God. And the construction process involved three things: the beauties of nature, classical music, and romantic love. Those were the three places on where the light fell for me. And through them, and it took a process of years, through them I realized that I needed to find out who God really was. And I was learning about God through those things. I love this quote that I don't think G.K. Chesterton originated it, but he kind of took credit for it later. He said, the worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a profound sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. And that's how I felt. I realized that God had been misrepresented to me. That God, whatever God was, it wasn't that person I learned about in my little tiny church. And as I encountered those goodness things, like music and nature and romantic love, I realized I would like to know the artist behind those. I would like to know the one who is somehow behind it. I want to get to know that God. And it took quite some time. It still is, I'm sure. But it's kind of that in-between period, maybe, that I'm hearing from you. The echoes in advance. We don't know where they're going to go for you. I certainly didn't in those days, but it was the sound of a tune that I hadn't really heard before.
How about one more question from Miranda Kennedy before we take a quick coffee break?
Thanks. This is kind of a straightforward question, I guess. So you say that you're a follower of Jesus, but Philip said that, Peter, you said that most of the readers of your book are ex-evangelicals. Can you just talk about why that is? Like, did you write more before you managed to reconstruct your faith? Or do you think that more people stuck on those books or those parts of your books? And also, I guess, how does it make you feel?
Well, I guess I would amend Pete's statement to say there are people who are my readers are people who are on their way to being an ex-evangelical. Most ex-evangelicals aren't cruising the internet, how can I recover my faith? And I think my books speak to people who are dissatisfied with what they're hearing in the evangelical system, and they're kind of moving away from it. And then they're attracted to something where I'm a little more honest and authentic about what you're going to, The second book I wrote was a book called Disappointment with God. And I took it to the publisher, and they said, we don't do books like that. We do books like The Christian Secret to a Happy Life. Why don't you change it to Overcoming, How I Overcame Disappointment with God? Because I don't want to reach those people. They don't need this book. It's the people who are actually disappointed with God. Fortunately, I won that argument. But I think those are the people, really. They're dissatisfied with the girl wash your face type books, that sell a lot, but somehow they don't meet the deep need. And I position myself rightly, not just a positioning, but kind of on the margins of faith, walking around the institution, trying to figure out what I can swallow and what I can't. And that is my authentic point of view. I have to be a steward to that point of view. And so it's probably people who are not finding what they really wanted in that evangelical world over here, but not willing to ditch the whole thing right now. The other thing is ex-evangelicals never go into a Christian bookstore, so
Touch that one too, Peter? Happy?
No.
Okay.
Good.
All right, so let's take a coffee break and come back, and we'll start off with Tim Dalrymple, Dahlia Mogahead, and others to follow, okay? Back to spiritual formation. And I think the first question of the afternoon is, let's go to Dahlia. Yeah.
Well, this question kind of emerged just as I was listening to you, and perhaps you've already answered it in some ways, but I'm really intrigued by the difference between you and the fact that you struggled to find this, you called it a pearl of great price within your faith, and didn't just give up on it, despite how much you struggled and had these negative experiences with faith. And what made your experience so different from the person that you sat next to in the plane who said, oh yeah, I had some experience with faith, but I'm done with that now? Is it you talked about Dr. Paul Rand?
Dr. Brand.
Dr. Brand, was that the key, or was there something else that made that difference for you?
Yeah, there was something else. And I've been writing a long time, and I just now told that full story in this book. It was a conversion experience. It was an unsought conversion experience that I had when I was in a very agnostic state, but on a Christian college campus, and being kind of the resident apostate on that campus. And I was just taken aback by an unsought and undesired conversion experience that changed everything in one night. But I think I mentioned advanced echoes. The advanced echoes for me were those three things that softened me and kind of purged out a lot of the toxicity of the church I grew up in. And so I was being prepared, is what it feels like. And then when the conversion story happened, it was just overnight. Yeah.
And part to my question, which is the role of awe in your spiritual journey, which when you talk about music and the created world and love, I wanted to just see if you could elaborate a little bit about the role of awe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awe and wonder. For me, growing up in a very unhealthy family, you got a little taste of my mother there in what I read. People respond in different ways. My brother was 2 years older, so he responded by taking her on, and he would always lose because he's a child, she's the adult. And so he would be beaten down all the time. And my own response was to create a shell around myself so that I couldn't be touched, affected. And that involved, probably if I were going through it now, I would be a cutter, one of these people who cuts themselves, I broke my own arm just to prove that I can do it without pain. And so I was in an unhealthy state, but what was your original question?
The role of awe.
Oh, the role of awe, yeah.
The role of awe.
So I was very ordered and in control. That was my goal. And I think that's what cutters do too. I am control. I can control my weight for anorexia. I can control my pain. And the things that kind of swept me off my feet, the romantic love was one. And my wife of 52 years is sitting right over there. So that's lasted. And I was swept off my feet by love. And in a similar way, just the kind of grace experiences of the beauties of walking in the southern woods and seeing a host of monarch butterflies, those kind of experiences that we've all had at some point. I have regularly in Colorado where I now live. There was that wonder and there was that awe, but it was mostly, for me, things that happened to me that I didn't organize for myself, that were unexpected. So romantic love was like that, and the conversion experience was very much like that because I was trying to get away from God, not toward God.
Pete, happy? Riata, Akio?
So I have two questions. The first one is, I heard from your lovely wife that you've been to 88 countries, I think, during lunch or so. And I'm just curious, I know you've been to Sarajevo, for example, as well. And I was just during the break now looking, I have the book, The Question That Never Goes Away, downloaded in my phone, actually, from 2019, and specific pages that I was just looking during the break. And one of my questions, I'll ask you one, the second one. So the first one would be, have you noticed, I'm just really genuinely curious, how are the conversations different when you're in those countries that as societies have gone through colossal tragedies? Is the conversation different? Of course, considering that individuals react differently, and in my own family, I have members who have completely lost faith in God during the war, or some who have completely gone uber religious, and then a lot of other members who have stayed floating in the middle, I guess. So I'm curious about those countrywide differences, maybe, if we can speak about such patterns. And the second one is related to something that you wrote in that book. And there's one passage where it says, "Where is God when it hurts? God is now in the church, God's delegated presence on earth." The question might even be rephrased, where is the church when it hurts? And I'm asking that because I constantly think about individual versus institutional spiritual solidarity and support. Because, for example, during the war in Bosnia, and I wrote about women who were victims and survivors of sexual violence and rape, and there's a very famous fatwa, or just like a message, spiritual message from a prominent cleric in 1993, which offered a humongous spiritual comfort to women at the time, where that cleric was actually criticizing the Islamic community for lack of institutional support to these women who were living through stigma, cultural feelings of shame, and they felt abandoned. But that was kind of a turning point, which meant a lot to these women. Or people who were pioneers of Islamic feminism use arguments from the Quran to help these women who were asking, am I a sinner? What will I do with children that are born out of rape? And that meant a lot to them. So just to these questions from your experience and perception about where is the church when it needs the most? Where's mosque? Or where are these institutions, and what can we do better about just galvanizing that? Because obviously it does provide a huge spiritual comfort to so many.
Right. When I was in Sarajevo, I interviewed a number of people, and mostly, this was 20 years after the actual conflict itself, and most of them told me stories of community that kind of grew out of the tragedy that was going on. Of course, there's that famous story of the cellist of Sarajevo, where people would gather to hear him, this brave man in the middle of a place where a slaughter had killed a bunch of people. And we heard other stories. I remember one of this woman who had, I think, 2 children, and she couldn't feed them anymore. She said, I couldn't keep them warm. And I took I took my grandmother's furniture that had been passed down, I broke it up, and I would burn it in the fireplace, and then I would tear the wood trim off of the doorways and burn it in the fireplace, and it was so cold right at Christmas. And one day, my Muslim neighbor, she's a Christian, my Muslim neighbor knocked on the door, and I opened the door, and he was holding this huge hunk. I had no idea what it was. And it was the root of a tree. And he said, the tree had been cut down long before, but I found this root under the dirt, and I dug it out for you to burn in your fireplace. And she said, I was so touched, because of course there was an interreligious conflict going on. And she said, of course I could never burn that. It sits like a shrine to community. And they would tell stories of, they got United Nations food parcels, but it was always the same. It was bland white, either noodles or rice, and that's all you got. And then someone would discover a little bit of paprika or even some blades of grass that had not been scorched. And they would have a big party and invite everybody in the area over. So those stories of community, we humans are amazingly resilient. How does the church respond? Well, I'm in touch right now with people in Ukraine, and the church is doing a remarkable job in Ukraine right now because it's an institution. They've got buildings. It's it's a supply chain, to get food. I support an organization that makes wood stoves for $250, and that will give you heat, and it keeps you a way to cook your food at the same time. And there are a lot of beautiful things going on in Ukraine in the midst of the tragedy. And I guess that's what the church should be. It should be a place of hope and practical help. You need a wood stove, and compassion. You mentioned this book, The Question That Never Goes Away. The publisher of that book in Ukrainian contacted me, and well, he asked me if he could translate it into Ukrainian. I said, sure. And he did, no royalties or anything. And he said what he found was many of the people who were shell-shocked by something that happened to them would grow silent. They just couldn't speak anymore. So these people would come in, and it would offer free food, and they would give them counseling. But when they would counsel them, they just wouldn't say anything. So he said, then we learned the best thing to do is read them stories of other people who have been through hard times. So he said, I started reading your book, and it was amazing. People would just open up because they weren't the only ones, and they would say, here's how I would handle it, or they would start talking. And when you see different cultures like that, we went to Japan after the tsunami that did kill 20,000 people, and Japanese it's very hard to know what's going on under what you see. They talk about it themselves, the hone and the tatamai. The tatamai is what everybody else sees. The hone is what's really going on. It's really hard to get to the hone with Japanese people. We remember how in the midst of this tragedy where people would stand in these neat little lines for 4 hours waiting for a bowl of rice, and Americans would be complaining, breaking in line, whatever, suing the people, and the Japanese just stand there, it's not my turn yet. So the cultural differences come in to play, there's no doubt about it. But the church, mosque, synagogue should be a place of light and a place of compassion. And wherever I have been in the midst of tragedy, that has come true.
Yeah, just to build on that as a general point, it's really interesting in the history of Christianity when you look at the extraordinary growth of the early church. And Rodney Stark, sociologist, has written about this, and so have others. And the question was, how did a movement of several dozen people in the first century Palestine, by the third century, become the dominant faith in the entire world? It was extraordinary growth. I mean, they've done this on estimates like per decade, how much of the Christian faith grew, and it's startling. And it had nothing to do with power or political power. The phrase that Rodney Stark used was communal care. That's what the church was known for, the care for the sick and the widows and the orphans, the welcoming of strangers, the outsider, respect for women who were at that time treated as second, third, fourth class citizens, and the connection with non-Christians. And that really is the thing that changed it. It had nothing to do with political power. And it is one of the interesting things now, the terrific panel earlier today touched some about this, about sort of the American story and the narrative. But I remember when I started my Christian journey being struck by the fact that Christianity was, in a sense, a religion of anti-power. I found that kind of quite intriguing. I didn't quite know what to do with it at first, but it was the whole notion of the cross and sacrifice and suffering. So something has happened along the way, and it's complicated because human beings are complicated, but it was this notion of wanting to use power to advocate what people thought was the moral good, but somehow the twinning of faith and power often doesn't end up well for the church. And that historical example of what really has led to the church being the church at its best is not power, but it's love and it's grace.
There's one more thing. There's a medical doctor at Duke University named Harold Koenig, Koening, And he does a lot of research, and he calculates that Christians, doesn't have to be Christians, anyone who goes to a church, mosque, synagogue at least twice a month, he's calculated that will counteract the negative effects of smoking 2 packs a day. So if you've really got to smoke, make sure you go to church. and he, he's kind of joking, but he says, actually, statistically, it's proved true. You recover from surgeries faster, you live longer. And the reason isn't some magical miracle. The reason is you're in a community that cares. And if you go into the hospital, the main thing you need is to not be anxious, not to be stressed, not to have your blood pressure up, your heart rate. But if you've got a community of people who say, I'll take care of your kids, I'll take care of your dog, I'll make sure you have food in the freezer to pull out and cook, then that allows you to give all of your personal psychic energy toward healing. Yeah. And I mean, it's verifiable. That's his job, to verify it.
Phil Gorski.
Yeah, I have 2 questions for both of you that sort of build off of questions that David and Anne asked. So the first question concerns the relationship between spiritual formation and character formation. I'm listening to you both speak about the relationship between spiritual formation, moral formation. I got the sense that spiritual formation is something that, if it doesn't directly motivate moral behavior, that it somehow recontextualizes it or animates it in some sense, or somehow prior to it. And this, of course, something that's often said as well about character formation or character education as well. And that sort of leads to the second question, which is, people who think in terms of virtue ethics and character formation see it as, well, a process of education, right? It's something that involves, pedagogy, that involves institutions. And so I guess that would be the second question. Is there something, if there's a kind of a spiritual malaise at the moment, does that have something to do with institutions, with failures of institutions?
You want to first start, Philip, then I'll weigh in.
I don't know. I really don't know. It's a great question. Part of it has to do with leadership. I remember reading a study that the founder of the Sojourners movement, Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. did on the Benedictines. Benedictines have been around for a long time, since 600 AD. So he studied their history, and he said they go in cycles like this. At first, this charismatic person named Benedict came along and said, we need to change the world. So he attracted idealistic people behind him. And when you have idealistic people wanting to change the world, you got to have discipline. So he came up with the rule of Benedict. And then they would live together, and they would live in poverty, and they would devote all their time to clearing the forests and planting crops and keeping the manuscripts copied and all of that kind of stuff. And then after a while, he said it's about a 200-year cycle. After a while, they would say, we don't actually have to go out in the vineyards and work on our own. We could hire people to do that, and we could just drink Benedictine brandy. And so they started doing that. And then about every 200 years, a new leader would come along and say, wait a minute, this isn't what Benedict had in mind. This isn't what Jesus had in mind, and start a revival, and they go through the cycle. And when I read that, because it went on for 1,400 years, it struck me, is there anything that we can do to stop that cycle? It seems to me we're kind of on that downward cycle now. How do we get it going again? Cultures do that, and countries do that. It's not just a spiritual thing. Is there any way to stop one of those cycles in the middle of it? And I don't know how you do that. I really don't.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Philip. I do think it's a failure of institutions. I've talked to a lot of pastors, both because I know them throughout my life in different places in the country and also for essays that I've done. And I actually think that pastors, probably more than anybody else, would testify to the failure of the church and the institutions. It's most painful for them because this is what they've devoted their life to, and they care so much about it. And so, in my experience with a lot of the pastors that I've talked to, there's a feeling of being burned out and overwhelmed, and feeling like, gosh, I've given my life to this effort, and it seems to not be going well. So I think there's undeniably a failure there. In saying that, I wouldn't want to discount at all the extraordinary acts of kindness and care and grace that goes on that people don't pay attention to. I think sometimes that isn't focused on enough. But having said that, there's obviously a real problem that's going on. And part of what I've heard from people when I've talked to them is the notion of catechesis, that is the shaping of the sensibilities. And what they've told me is something to the effect of, look, cable news and politics and social media gets them for 15 or 20 or 25 hours a week, and we get them for 45 minutes or an hour, hour and a half. Maybe there's a Bible study every other week going on. So we're just kind of overwhelmed by this. And so people are coming in with their sensibilities shaped, and then they're bringing those into the church, and then a lot of proof texting goes on. So that's, I think, what people are facing. In terms of how to think about it, and there are a lot of pastors who are thinking about this, and it's the idea of a friend of mine is Jewish, Yuval Levin, and Yuval has talked a lot about this notion of there being a tremendous opportunity for religious institutions now. They're just not taking advantage of it. That is, in a way, that one of the dominant issues of our time is alienation, loneliness, despair. There are all sorts of metrics to show it, but we know we're in this period. And if the church could offer community and a refuge and a place of hope and a home, I think it would have a huge magnetic effect on a lot of people. And again, some churches are doing that, but I don't think nearly enough are. And I think when the church is seen as the tip of the spear of the culture war, it's having some of the opposite effect.
We should plug Anne's Fabric of Character booklet that features a bunch of stories around the country as well, right, as a resource on this topic. Tim Dalrymple, you have another one.
Sure. I'm sure a lot of us, as we gather here, are mindful of Mike Gerson, a dear member of this community who passed away too early, and of Mike Cromarty, the founder of this, who was also taken away too early. And so I welcome your thoughts on this, Pete, but I'll direct this toward you specifically, Philip, given your Parkinson's diagnosis that came not too long ago. And so I'm curious and I ask this question tenderly, knowing you and your equally amazing wife, Janet, but I'm curious what you've learned from your journalism, from the profiles, from the people who've mentored you, that you want to kind of bring into your own confrontation with mortality. And obviously there are ways to extend the time frame, and I know you're in great health in so many different ways, but this must be a topic on your mind, and I wonder if you could share your reflections a little bit with us.
Yeah, it's kind of breaking news, Tim. I found out I had Parkinson's at the very end of January, and first I just shrugged it off and said, well, I'm fine. And then the next week I played pickleball for the very first time and was diving for a ball, and I had no reflexes and just did a face plant and ended up 8 hours in the emergency room that night with a hematoma right over my eye. And I realized things have changed, because the natural response is to put out your hands and break the ball. And people around me said I just fell straight like that. There were no reflexes. And so it was a wake-up call, and then I started the medication and immediately became a carbidopa levodopa addict. If I miss one pill, my brain starts buzzing. And I started going through my life and realizing I have to let go of things. I can't climb mountains anymore. It's too dangerous if I slip off a rock. I can't do on a mountain bike what I used to do. I'm definitely not going to play pickleball. And in a sense, it's like a preview of aging where everything gets compressed. What can I safely do now? And so there's that aspect of loss. And then there's that aspect of not fear, but anxiety. I got to confess, coming here, I've not been in a repartee situation since getting this diagnosis. How will I do when you ask me questions and put me on the spot? You know, I was anxious about that. Whereas a year ago, I might have been energized by it. You mentioned Michael Gerson, and I think it was Pete who wrote a loving tribute to him, and he said at his very top, the peak of his success, he devoted his energy to caring for the people at the bottom of the ladder, especially with the AIDS in Africa programs through George Bush. And when he was really needy, when he was at the lowest part, he reflected back with gratitude on how wonderful his life had been. And I think those two things, that really stuck with me. And I heard that before I was diagnosed, and I thought, now there's a goal, there's something to work toward. I sense that already in how I view other people. I've been through this process with my brother who's disabled from a stroke, and yet it's different when it's me. So like even on the airplane on the way down here, there was an elderly man in first class. We were not in first class, but we were right behind. And he was so slow in getting up and getting his bag out of the top and sitting in the wrong seat and going to the restroom and blocking the aisles. And, you know, I realized that could be me before very long at all. And I started viewing him in a different way because it's so easy to see people around us. And then I started hearing about all these other people who had Parkinson's disease. And I was saying to my friend, it's kind of like when you get a new car, you know, you get a Toyota Camry and then suddenly you notice everybody's got a Toyota Camry. They're all over the place. But it's not like you get a new car at all. It's like you get an old car, you know. And those are adjustments. But so turn up the hearing aid, Philip. How can I be a steward of this next chapter of my life? It's not one that I would have chosen. I'm going to lose a lot of things that I enjoy. But we do that, don't we, as we grow old, whether we like it or not. And we definitely do it as we die. We lose everything. So it's a learning experience. And I pray that I can learn with humility and with grace. And when I wrote, and Christianity Today picked it up, I got several hundred responses from people who have read something I've written over the years, just telling me, what you do makes a difference. Don't stop, and use this experience too to help feeding us. We're looking to you for wisdom. And it was very humbling to read those things because I didn't know those things were taking place over the last years, but they all came out right when people identified with me, and they would tell me their own stories of suffering. And that's one thing that we all have in common at one level or another. Some people it's psychological, some people it's very personal and physical. But that's shared humanity, and it's one of the great challenges of the church and of us as fellow human beings.
I just want to say about Philip that in sharing that story and being vulnerable about that story, it was a huge gift to other people. And one of the things that I think the reason why so many of your books have resonated with people is that he's just very honest, and there are no prefabricated explanations. And so when he talks about disappointment with God or suffering, these are really honest and searching questions, and people don't get the sense that this is somebody who's twisting themselves in knots, trying to offer up answers that are often unanswerable. As I've gotten older, I appreciate much more the notion of the mystery of faith and the effort to try and explain life in very neat and tidy ways. I just don't think that works nearly as well. There's just things that are inexplicable, and I think sometimes you just have to name that. And the other thing, which Philip, you and I have talked about, I know this is something that's important to you, and it is to me, just as people of the Christian faith, which is the notion that it's a faith that understands suffering, and it's the notion that for us, in terms of Jesus, is someone who has gone through suffering. That doesn't make any particular moment in your own life when you have terrible pain or hardship less, but it somehow, I think in your experience and in different ways in my experience, it somehow is a sense of sympathy and empathy, and somehow that we feel like through that faith that God has gone through it and understands it, and that somehow is a comfort. But it's hard to articulate why, but just from a personal experience, that's been true for me.
Might be a perfect place on which to end, huh? Maybe we take a moment. You get 6 minutes of bonus free time if we excuse. Thank you so much, guys. If you haven't read Pete's essay about this book in the Atlantic, please do at your convenience. It's worth it. I might have been wrong. There's so much in there. So it's hey, thank you, Philip Yancey and Pete Wayner.
Thanks, Philip.